Hello students, welcome back. And today I'm here again with you talking about sociology of media. Now, you have already studied a lot with reference to the lectures which were delivered previously, the sociological framework theoretically. Right? And also you have been given some lectures which were rather practice-based. So you have already a knowledge of research design or vis-a-vis the research methods which can be used when particularly you're using the sociology of media framework while researching. In my last lecture, I also spoke at length about how to analyze films, right? And films particularly as a unit of media. Now today I thought, because in the last session of our lectures we are talking rather about the application based, how you can apply everything you have learned till now in your research or in writing an article and so on and so forth. So I thought about talking at length about one particular method which many of you will use while researching on media. And this particular method is none other than ethnography. So today I have kind of named my lecture as Ethnography in Media, vis-a-vis how you go ahead and use ethnography as a method while doing media research. Now, to begin with, what is ethnography? As I said, of course, you have, these topics are touched upon in your previous lecture when you got an in-depth understanding of research methods. But nonetheless, we will talk about ethnography in greater details today in the entirety of this lecture. And in my next lecture, I'm going to talk about some of the variations of the ethnography, which I'm sure will be very, very helpful to you. Now, what is ethnography? Ethnography is a research method, I'm reading, is a research method that involves studying people and cultures in their natural setting. It is an observational approach that aims to understand the social and cultural practices of a group of people by immersing oneself in the community. Right? So, ethnography comes from the Greek word ethos, meaning people, or nation, right? And grapho, meaning to write. So basically, inherently, what are you doing? You're writing about people. But how are you writing about people? You're writing about people by mixing with them, by talking with them, by spending considerable time with the culture, right, which you are dealing with, by documenting about the culture of that particular community, whoever you are researching on. Now, ethnographers typically spend an extended period of time in the field, right? Be it interviewing their people, as in people whom they are researching on, or kind of just spending time with them on field, right? Something which is called participation observation, which I will cover a little later on. Right? So they participate in cultural events, collect artifacts, so on and so forth. So right now I'm talking about ethnography in a much more overarchingly manner, but then later in my lecture I'll also talk about how you connect ethnography particularly to media. Right? One of the key principle of ethnography is the holistic approach, meaning that it seeks to understand the culture as a whole, right, by focusing on individual aspects of it. So you focus on the individual aspects, but you kind of have a collated understanding of a culture of a particular community. Ethnographers attempt to grasp the underlying social, economic, and political factors. So every cultural belief or cultural practice is often shaped by several factors, just like work of art. Remember in the last lecture I was saying that any particular film is also shaped by, social factors, economical factors, political factors, the origin of the filmmaker, so on and so forth. Similarly, every culture, right, across societies is also shaped by number of these factors. So ethnographers will study at length about all of these underlying reasons, underlying factors which ultimately led to rise or growth of a particular cultural belief or even a cultural practice, right? Ethnography has been used to study a wide variety of cultures, from indigenous tribes in remote areas, right, to urban communities in modern cities, right? It has also been applied in various fields, including anthropology, sociology. In fact, ethnography is one of the most popular research method in sociology, of course, something which we are dealing with right now. But even it's equally applicable when you are studying psychology, education, right, anthropology, and particularly even, I kind of try to establish here that ethnography is actually also one of the very, very important method while studying media. In fact, in my later lecture, or if I find time in this in this lecture or the forthcoming lecture, I'll talk about how in my own research, right, in my own PhD research, I kind of used ethnography, or I will also talk about the ways in which you can identify research topics and then can use ethnography as a method to carry out the research. Now there are 4 components of ethnography. Right. Now, in certain cases, in certain books, you will find many more components. So we'll talk about them as well. But more or less, ethnography can be encapsulated in these 4 methods. Number 1 is participation observation. We'll, of course, talk about each one of them is at length, but just to give you a definition, what is participation observation? This involves living among the people, being studied and observing their activities, interaction, and observation. So this is where you live with the participants, live with the community whom you are studying on. Then there is interviews, which of course is one of the most common method in social science. Of course, when you are kind of doing any research on media as well, interviews is a very common method. These are structured interviews. Remember, it's not unstructured interview. So structured interview, where you have a set of questions, where you know whom you are addressing. So it's a structured interview conducted with members of the culture whom you are studying. So that's basically the ethnographic interviews. Next is focus group, right? So a discussion with a particular group, particular sample, particular group whom you have decided from the larger community you are trying to study. So these are group discussions rather, right? Group discussions that aim to uncover common beliefs, common practices, right? So you gain an understanding about the entire community by having a group discussion with a smaller sample. And lastly, ethnographic survey, though I have my reservations about this, whether I can actually call survey and bring under ethnography, because surveys are often quantitative methods, but sometimes even if a survey is a quantitative method, and I'm not going into details of survey because you must have touched upon surveys when you were looking at research methods, but in sometimes quantification of data becomes important. So I was so for example, if I say there's a trend in Hindi cinema about women empowerment, so I might have a participation observation with these filmmakers. I might have focus group interviews with filmmakers who are now making women-oriented films, or I might interview them at large. But some sort of numerical numbers in terms of how many films were made in so and so year or across these years will also be helpful. So that kind of somewhere you collect data through questionnaires or sometimes in quantitative methods. Of course, surveys can be of all sorts, and again, I'm not going into the details of surveys. Now, while conducting ethnographic research, of course, you have to take certain consideration, and the most important consideration, and I'll talk about it at length. I mean, every time I talk about any research method, I will talk about it, is privacy and confidentiality, right? You might be studying a particular group, right? But it depends upon how open that group is, right? You have to respect the privacy of the respondents, be it an interview, be it a focus group, be it participation observation, right? You have to keep that in mind. Also, if somebody wants to say something to you which is confidential, so it's taken for granted that the researcher under no circumstances will break that confidentiality, right? Sometimes say suppose if it's a very sensitive issue, say if it's a case of child abuse or something of that sort, then confidentiality becomes very, very important, right? So on and so forth. So please keep that in mind, that it's an unsaid rule that being a researcher, you have to protect the privacy and confidentiality of your respondents. They should not be harmed, or respondents should not be exploited in any ways. In conclusion, ethnography is a powerful research method that allows us to gain insights into beliefs, values, practices of different cultures. By immersing ourselves in the communities we are studying, we can gain deep understanding of the social and cultural dynamics of every group. So, of course, ethnography is a very valuable tool for researchers in many fields and has the potential to provide valuable insight into the diverse world. Now, coming to the point which I am talking about, is that fine, you understand what ethnography is, which is about, talking to people, focus group, participation, observation, and you kind of figure out their culture, beliefs, practices. But what about media? Because right now we are trying to figure out that whether ethnography can be used as a method to study media. And indeed it can. Right? It can be applied to a wide range of media, including traditional mass media such as television, newspaper, radio, as well as newer forms of media such as social media, online communities, and mobile devices. To conduct an ethnographic study of media, researchers typically spend extended period of time observing and interacting with people in natural settings. So that's the idea of ethnography, right? To interact with people in their natural setting. They may also conduct interviews, participate in media-related events, and collect artifacts such as media content, advertisement, user-generated content, and so on. So to explain this, let me just a little bit go into my dissertation again. So basically I research on media industries, right? And during my PhD dissertation, I was trying to figure out that how the Hindi film industry have changed, right, in the new millennium. And when I say in the new millennium, I was looking at Hindi film industry with the lens of digitization, from the lens of changing business environment of Hindi film industry, from the lens of stardom, and so on and so forth. So how do I go about it? Of course, I interview people. That's the most common thing. And the moment I say I'm interviewing people, look, I'm using ethnography as a method. So I interviewed a lot of filmmakers. I interviewed a lot of technicians. I interviewed a lot of people who were not directly related to making of the film, but rather they were kind of involved with the business aspect of the film. So then this becomes what? This directly becomes what we are talking about, interview method, right? I also did a lot of participation observation where I was a part of a process of making a film, right? So I was not doing anything, right? I was not an active participant, but I was generally an observer, right? So then that makes me participation observation. So this is a way, I just gave you an example of how you can use ethnography while you kind of study any media. I mean, of course, Bollywood is media, but then anything at all is media. So similar to Bollywood, you can look at any other media industry vis-a-vis, but you can also look at how these media artifacts impact a certain community. That is also comes under ethnography. So some of the advantages of we were going into ethnography in media. Some of the advantages of using ethnography as a study of media is that it allows researchers to gain a deep understanding of how media is used and understood in different cultural contexts. By immersing themselves in media cultures they are studying, researchers can gain insight into the meaning and the value that are attached to the media content and how these meanings are negotiated and contested among different groups of people. Remember, in one of the previous lectures, I was talking about Stuart Hall, right? And who Stuart Hall talks about that how, the decoding of the media text happens differently by different culturals in different cultural settings. So the decoding of the same media's text can happen differently in different cultural settings. At the same point of time, decoding of the media text will happen differently across different cultures, right? So again, this is a very good example how you can look at how media impacts people and how this impact is actually different for different cultural settings and for people of different community, right? And fantastic areas of research if you apply this broad framework to studying any media piece of news or any particular platform and so on so forth. So the list is kind of endless in terms of application. Another advantage of ethnography is that it allows researchers to explore the complex social and cultural dynamics that underline any media use. So this is actually elaboration of what I was already saying. So for example, a researcher may use ethnography to study the role of media in the construction of identity, the formation of social relationships, or the negotiation of power and authority. The Bollywood example I was giving, right? So, it was very interesting to look at the power dynamics between people in the film set, right? And here that particular people who were involved in the film is the community I am looking at, right? And then I'm trying to figure out power dynamics. I can look at social relationships, and there are endless things which you might look at when you are studying a particular community. Ethnography can be also used to study media industries, and this is what I was talking about, and the production process. So so ethnography can be used to study both the things. One is the audience and how audience interpret media and consume the same media in different manner, or the impact per se, and it can also look at the industry, right? And another thing, it can also look at the platform. So there are multiple ways actually in which ethnography can be used while studying media. Now this brings me to the first quiz, students, and my first quiz is very simple. I'm just asking you, what is ethnography? I give you 4 options. One is a quantitative research method. Second, a qualitative research method. Third, a statistical analysis technique. And the fourth, a type of, it's no research at all. So the answer to the question is that it's a qualitative research method. Please don't confuse with the fact, because I mentioned survey earlier, because ideally, when I talk about survey here, I'm rather talking about a qualitative survey and not a quantitative survey. Yes, students. So before we go on individually to each of the techniques, I would like to talk about some of the considerations you take while you're using ethnographic method to study media. It is important to consider once again the ethical considerations. I know you must be thinking that I just repeated what I'm going to say right now, but yes, it's very important that at every step you remember, whether you're researching media or any other cultural community or any other community, as a matter of fact, you have to take into consideration about privacy and confidentiality. But apart from that, there's also one more thing. As researchers, we are often biased, right? We are often biased towards a certain kind of attitude and belief, which we are trying to say. So you have to remember that as a researcher, you have to remain unbiased, right? And do not add your own perspective onto the research, because then you understand the validity of the research does not remain, right? So you have to take that into account. Also, the research has to be inclusive, right, and represent a diverse voice. You can't just have a very small sample and you say that, okay, so I have only interviewed, say something in my research. If I talk about that the nature of stardom in Bombay film industry, in Hindi film industry has changed, and then I kind of have a very small sample whom I kind of look at, and then I can't make such conclusions, right? So you can't make conclusions without having the diverse voices taken into account. Also, you cannot reach conclusions if you are biased about, you have already preconceived. So of course you will have hypothesis. What is hypothesis? That is, you already have a research question and you kind of have an answer to it. But then the idea of the research is to find out whether that, the idea or the hypothesis which you have in with you, whether it's correct or not, right? So for that you need to have a correct sample size, or you need to have correct number of case studies, and you need to kind of take into account the diverse voices. In conclusion, ethnography is indeed a valuable research method for studying media and its impact on the society. By immersing themselves in the media culture they are studying, they, in the sense the researchers can gain a deep understanding of how media is used and understood in different culture. Say suppose you're talking about media and propaganda, right? And you say that media is a tool for propaganda. So then you will have to test. Now this is what a hypothesis is. The question can be, is media a tool for propaganda? Of course, it's very wide. You need to narrow down. So you can take a particular piece of media text and then connect it to propaganda. And then your hypothesis may be that, yes, media indeed is a tool for propaganda. But then you will have to find out. So for finding out, you will do focus group interviews. You will talk to people who have consumed that piece of media, right? You will have one-on-one interviews with the you will stay with those people who have consumed with the media, right? So, and then you will kind of come to any sort of conclusion. You cannot just be biased and say, oh, we already know that media kind of is propaganda, and so on and so forth, right? So media, by using ethnography, you can study that how media kind of shapes our beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors. Now let's go on one by one onto each of the techniques which we have already discussed. So we first discussed what? Participation observation. What is participation observation? Participation observation is a research method that is often used in media research. It involves the researcher immersing themselves in the media culture they are studying. Remember, even though I'm talking about participation observation, talking about interviews, but I'm talking all of it in context of media, so that because that's the lecture is all about. So you have to, you in the sense the researcher, have to kind of participate in media related activities, observing, interacting with individual groups in their natural setting, right? So my example of participation of observation would be, I was a part of 3 or 4 films, right? So say for 15 days they were shooting, so I was there as a part of the process for 15 long days without actually doing anything. So I was not having a role in the filmmaking, but I was just silently looking at, right, what was happening in the film sets to draw any inferences based on my observation. Right, so I think that makes participation observation clear. Of course, participation observation has an advantage because it gives me in the sense the researcher, a very deep understanding of the media culture. How will you understand, right? You cannot understand the equation of a film set without being a part of the film set. Everything else is secondary research, right? So you may read about, say Tejaswini Gandhi, if I'm talking about Bollywood and if I'm talking about Hindi film industry, Tejaswini Gandhi has done this fantastic book called fantastic book. She has actually producing Bollywood. Sorry, I was kind of trying to recall 2012 book where she talks about these dynamics and she gives us detailed accounts of these dynamics which happens in film set. So that sort of deep understanding of media culture is not possible if you're not a part and parcel of that media group. Right, so I'm talking about the production side of it. You can also, of course, talk about the consumption side of it. Another is it allows the researchers to build a rapport and trust within the individual and group. So once the participation observation is over, of course you will go ahead and then interview the members of the community. Now, nobody will, if suddenly today I approach somebody, right, a filmmaker and so on, and say, I am this researcher, I'm a faculty, I research on cinema, will you just interview? Then, even if that person allows me to interview, it will be very on the surface. There are many things. First of all, I might not get access to the person, right? And secondly, even if the interview happens, it might be on the very surface level. So in order to kind of bridge that gap, in order to make that other person friend, right, who will now talk to you, if not a friend, at least a good acquaintance. So that's also becomes very helpful when you do a participation observation. Explore the complex social and cultural dynamics. Now, human beings are very, very complex in nature. And our interactions to each other, right, are also equally complex. And our interactions, again, all of these things come into being. Remember, we are talking about economical, political, social, right? So all of this kind of dynamics come into. Yesterday, I was seeing a short research, as in it was shot on video, but it was a research on the urban house helps, right? So again, tomorrow, if I decide, I'm going to research on the urban house helps, and if I make them sit down and start asking questions, they will not open up to me. So for that, I need to be friends with them. And for being friends with anyone, you need to be a part of their life. So that's what participation observation. You kind of look at, you spend extensive amount of time with that community. And then you will understand that humans, because our research, social science research, media research, are very complex social and cultural dynamics which kind of play amongst themselves. So that kind of is an advantage. Of course, there's disadvantage also because it's time consuming. So when I ask my students to do a participation observation, it will take a survey is something which is quicker, right? You prepare a set of questions and you kind of give away and you have some sort of inference. But here you have to spend, and you cannot say I've spent a day and say I've done participation observation. So of course that's participation observation on some level, but it's good to spend a considerable amount of time. Another challenge is the bias, right? The more time you spend with your subjects, there's a tendency to be biased. So as a researcher, you have to be with your community, but at the same point of time maintain a distance, right? The perspective should not be biased. Furthermore, participation observation raises ethical concerns, right? Not everybody will allow you to be a part of that community. And the consent has to be informed. The privacy and the confidentiality has to be maintained. So in conclusion, participation observation is a valuable research method for media researchers. It allows researchers to gain a deep understanding of the media culture being studied, build rapport and trust with participants, most importantly, I was talking about that, and explore the complex social and cultural dynamics that underline media use. However, it also has its limitations and challenges, which we already spoke about. Now, I'm going to play for you a small clip which is available on YouTube, and it's an account by one of the researcher, and I'm going to speak, it's an account of the participation observation, but the participation observation is kind of documented to a certain extent. So please have a look.
When I first came to the Kalasha Valleys in northern Pakistan to conduct PhD dissertation research on Kalasha women's culture, I was stunned by the din and buzz of daily life in this small pastoral place. I taped it on my state-of-the-art cassette recorder, thinking no one would believe me otherwise. But when I came home 2 years later and played it to astonish my friends and colleagues, I didn't hear chaotic noise anymore. I heard the very particular words and voices of individual men, women, and children who had become real to me. Even though I was especially interested in observing their bishali, the communal menstrual house where women went when they were menstruating and to give birth, I'd never actually held a newborn before. I waited anxiously for the birth of Talim Khan and Nana's child. When the time came, together with the midwife, We walked the half-mile up valley to the Bashali in the middle of the night, our way lit by little torches of resin-soaked wood. The birth was quick. The baby boy was big and healthy. The midwife cut the cord, swaddled him up, and then made a special sweet cream-of-wheat porridge for Talim Khan and Nana. All night we Bashali women, even me, took turns holding the baby around the fire while his mother slept. Talim Khan and Nana said I was his aunt, and said I should have a baby girl, and then we would marry our children, and we'd be Kaltabar.
So students, this brings us to quiz number 2, right? And it's a pretty simple one again. What is participation observation? Is it a type of a quantitative research method? Quantitative. Is it a type of a qualitative research method? Is it a statistical analysis technique? Or is it a survey method, survey research? So the answer is that it is a qualitative research method, right? Okay. So we now go on to the another technique, which is, of course, the most popular and the most common. It's called ethnographic interviews. Ethnographic interviews are qualitative interview method. Remember, both participation observation was also qualitative. This is also qualitative. I'm not going into qualitative, quantitative because you have already learned about them in the previous lecture. Now, what does it involve? It involves interviewing people, but the idea is to interview them in their natural setting. Often we sometimes digress and we kind of not interview people in their natural setting, but that's the idea. So you interview people in their home, workplace, community places, and so on. What is the idea of the interviews? To gain in-depth understanding. The more you interview, the more questions you have, the more at length you have detailed interview. So in my research, for example, I had detailed interview with all sorts of people. So people who were filmmakers, but also people who were from the business side of it. So I went to Yashraj and I interviewed the kind of, marketing people and whosoever I could get my hands on, I interviewed them. So and also remember the number of interviews also ideally should be a substantial number and not just 1 or 2. So you cannot say I have an in-depth inference just out of 1 or 2 interviews. Now, one of the key advantages, of course, the data, the rich and detailed data that can be provided, right? And another advantage is the rapport you build and the trust with a participant, right? But then there are challenges. So of course, I mean, it's also easy as compared to participation observation. It's not as time-taking, but there are challenges. Number one, participants may not always be forthcoming, right? So not everybody is very vocal, right? So it's that's why it's also it kind of becomes easier if you interview somebody after you have spent time in participation observation, because otherwise it's very difficult for the researcher sometimes to make people open up, right? Of course, interviews are also time taking, and that's also a limitation. And the research questions should be very carefully considered. That's actually the art, right? That's where the researcher comes into place, and his or her kind of that kind of becomes very important, that you kind of ask the right questions, which is true for literally any interview, but definitely for research interview. In summary, ethnographic interviews are a valuable research method used in ethnography to collect rich and detailed data, right? Now, I also have something for you. After that, we'll quickly go to the quiz, is that this is an ethnographic interview from an anthropology virtual classroom. So just have a look, just the 1 minute perhaps, or not even that.
I didn't know anything about the land I was passing through, what I was seeing, and I spent a lot of time just thinking about the people I met along the road. And when I got back to Europe a year later, I was really curious. I just wanted to know more. I wanted to learn about where I'd been and what I'd seen, because I'd not had an opportunity to read about it in advance, or really to think about where I was going to go in advance. And that took me to study anthropology at the University of Manchester at the time. So I really stumbled into it because I'd been on holiday by chance, and then after I'd finished my first degree, I went back to India again to think about the things I'd been studying, but to think about it in the context of being in India.
Welcome back, students. And here I come to the last quiz with which we shall end our lecture. The question is, which of the following is an advantage of using ethnographic interview? They are quick and easy to conduct. They provide quantitative data. They allow for a deep understanding of the interviewee's experience and perspective. They are suitable for all types of research studies. The correct answer will be they allow for a deep understanding of interviewee's experience and perspective. With that, we end our lecture. See you again in the next lecture. Thank you.